We open the program today with a keynote from Jorge Caraballo, who's the growth editor of Radio Ambulante. And one of the objectives of Radio Ambulante is to connect Latin America through stories. With 7 years and more than 135 episodes published, Radio Ambulante's narrative journalism podcast in Spanish has become a reference and has helped to form a community of participatory and diverse listeners throughout the continent. Jorge is going to be sharing this rich experience and explaining how nonfiction narratives can be used to make the cultural borders of Spanish-speaking countries fluent, connect communities, and resolve conflicts. So please welcome Jorge Caraballo.
Thank you. So yes, thanks for being here. My name is Jorge. I work as the growth editor at Radio Ambulante. But before I start, I want to ask a question. Who here have listened to or listens to Radio Ambulante? Just raise their hand. Great, thank you. Okay, for those who don't know it, it's a podcast in Spanish. We tell uniquely Latin American stories, and we are distributed by NPR, that is a public radio here in the US. Well, they're in the US. Another question. Who here listened to podcasts, to any podcast? Just raise their hand. Great, that's great. For those of you that didn't raise their hand, let me guess. I know that more and more often you're listening from friends, colleagues, family who are trying to convert you into a podcast listeners, right? Because podcasts are trendy right now. And they're trendy maybe because we are so attacked by screens that are demanding our attention all the time, in our phone, in our watch, in our laptop, TVs, everywhere, that listening to stories in audio may be a more organic and way to interact with information. So I'm going to talk more about why podcasts are a very, very interesting medium for you, peace builders, activists, in this digital age. It gives us relief, and it has a very strong impact. Today's keynote is about physical borders, and we will use Radio Ambulante's case. We will share some of our learnings. We've been telling stories for 7 years, almost 150 episodes. So we will talk a little bit about what makes a good audio story work, like what do you need if you want to create a podcast, a narrative podcast, so it has the impact that you want it to have. We will share some insights about why podcasts are so unique right now, and we will mention a couple of professional challenges that we're tackling right now. But let's start with a little bit of context. So let me use this. In the very beginning, since the very beginning of Radio Ambulante, there is a belief that resonates with the theme of this conference, is this: political boundaries are rigid, are strict, is what we just saw, what we just experienced, but cultural boundaries are a lot more fluid. So this morning, we crossed a wall that divides two countries, a line that was established in the mid-1800s, and that used to be, as you see in the picture, much, much further north. And to move that line to the south, a nation required fictions, required supremacy stories that mobilize people, the necessary rhetoric to mobilize people to fight for what they thought belonged to them, right? So a war was fought, a war changed this map. Now the wall is where we saw it, and that wall has been there for almost 2 centuries, right? It's static. It's very, very hard to move that, right? And after almost 2 centuries, the border remains right there, like an expression of power, is protected at the same time by stories that present it like an indisputable mandate, and also, as you saw, by guns. But this border, like any border, is the representation of a story that pretends to be like closed. Like that border is like, you cannot discuss, this is the border, this is it. You cannot move it, don't talk about it, this is it. But around that static narrative, there are countless stories that bustle around it in sharp contrast with that stillness. Borders are usually scenarios of transformation for those who cross them. Ultimately, an obstacle is always a trigger of change. Humans, when we encounter with an obstacle, we change ourselves. So borders trigger transformations. And for storytellers, as we are journalists, the border is filled with possibilities. On some level, it's a schism, it's a fracture, a tangible fiction that separates two orders, a here from there and us from them, a convention that serves as a form of control of the scope of authority and the mobility, on the people's mobility. But it's also a point of exchange, of contact, of recognition in the difference, who we are, where we are. So that ambivalence of the border is the source of conflicts and resolution, of identities put to test, identities that open up to the unknown and transform themselves. All that is like storyteller's paradise, right? A lot of things are happening there. Your identity, it's always on the edge when you encounter a border. So that's why we focus there. It's not a coincidence that almost a third of our 150 episodes are about migration. People moving across the borders that we built in the continent. The Latin American identity, as you may know, is defined by migration. And to understand it, we believe that it's inevitably to explore why and how we cross those borders. The Ambulante in our name refers in part to that. So that's Carolina Guerrero. This is Daniel Alarcón. They are the founders of Radio Ambulante. Both of them are migrants, and they met here in the US. She's Colombian, he's Peruvian. They've done their careers here. And in 2011, they met in that corner. They were waiting for their kid to go out of school, and they were there in the Dubois Park Cafe in San Francisco, imagining what would their careers look like if they did small changes. And that's exactly the point where Radio Ambulante was born, in a conversation in that cafe. They decided to create a podcast about what it means to be Latin American, what connects us as Latin American. It's a simple question, but it's very unfamiliar for a region that is not used to think about itself beyond very nationality identities, right? National identities. So what it means to be a region. So we started telling stories to cover that, to answer that question. And as Daniel and Carolina, many of us at Radio Ambulante, we're migrants too. So we understand what it means to move across the borders, what it means to get here to the US. And we're worried about the humanizing rhetoric of some politicians, and we're also worried about some media narratives that we see there that cover migration as an emergency, for example, as a crisis, as the invasion, or as the wave, as the caravan. Many of these words that present migrants as a threat. And we don't cover it like that, because we know that, as you see in that picture, that it's an all the illustrations are by artists illustrating our episodes. As you see there, borders also help us to connect each other, to recognize the difference. And that's how we want to tell it. It's a human issue, not only a political issue. There's something unique about the journalism we do, and that has helped us to grow. We started in 2012, the first season, after a Kickstarter campaign. That was the first successful Kickstarter campaign for a podcast. We raised $46,000 in a month, and we only had 7,000 listeners. It may seem a lot, but it was not that much. Then we started growing a lot. In 2016, we signed a distribution agreement with NPR. We're the only podcast in Spanish in NPR, and that created a big boost for numbers, and now we're being listened by 5 million people all over the world. And what makes Radio Ambulante unique is that our stories are told by the main characters of those stories. We don't parachute to cover foreign events. We just find the people that lived the event, and we work with them, so they're with their own voices telling you what happened. So we're gonna listen to a couple of clips so you can get a taste of what Radio Ambulante is. And at the same time, those clips will describe 3 elements that you need to get when you do an interview for radio. Your many of you are here because you want to build peace, right? And I think there is a very interesting intersection between journalists and peace builders, and that is that we tell stories. If we want to transform conflicts, we need to transform the narratives. So if we understand how those narratives work, then we will have more power. So we will describe 3 different elements that you need to get when you want to prepare a story for audio, okay? So the first thing is that you need that those characters describe the action. There are 3 different kinds of tape: narrative tape, descriptive tape, and interpretive tape. You go, I don't know, let's imagine that there's someone in the corner and you find that he or she has an amazing story, you want to tell it because it's important for your field, and when you're doing that interview, you need to be sure that you will get the 3 different kinds of tape that we are seeing here. And I will show you some examples. The first one is about this story that we published in 2017. It's called The Long Road. There are only 90 miles that separate Cuba from Florida. But in 2017, before the wet feet, dry feet policy ended, that was the policy that allowed Cubans that touched American territory to stay there legally. Before that, hundreds of thousands of Cubans decided to take another road. They were not going to risk themselves to sink in a raft in the Caribbean Sea. So they flew to South America, and from South America, Colombia, Ecuador, they started walking up north, taking buses, taking trains, in a very, very risky road that crossed at least 8 borders. So we interviewed 2 of them, Raquel y Joandra, that did that route, their brother and sister, and they did that route with a little 6-year-old, who was Joandra's son. And in the 4th day, while they were crossing the jungle, the Darien jungle, that is one of the most dense forests on Earth, they lost their guide, they lost their group, and they ran out of food. But they found a man, they found an Indian guy. So let's listen what they describe. Listen to the verbs, to the action.
Lo encontramos en el camino, él se había separado de su grupo porque tenía un pie lastimado, ya no podía caminar con la misma rapidez que caminaban los otros, entonces se quedó solo.
Continuaron el camino juntos y el indio fue muy amable al compartir con ellos un poco del arroz que cargaba en su bulto.
Nada, él se refugió ahí con nosotros, acampó con nosotros esa noche, pero ya el otro día ya se tuvo que quedar. Comenzamos la caminata de nuevo temprano.
Joandra and Raquel found another group with another guide, and they joined them, but the Indian guy, he just couldn't keep the pace.
Lo encontramos en el camino, él se había separado de su grupo. Que tenía un pie lastimado, ya no podía caminar con la misma rapidez que caminaban los otros, entonces se quedó solo.
Continuaron el camino juntos y el indio fue muy amable al compartir con ellos un poco del arroz que cargaba.
So, verbs, verbs, and verbs. It's very hard to lose your attention from what they're describing because they're describing a sequence of events that are building on each other. So that's narrative tape. It's a string of events, rising action that it will eventually explode into something bigger, but you're there, you're on the edge. But it's not enough to tell you what's happening. The character also needs to describe the scenario where the action is unfolding, right? Remember, your eyes in an audio story are not doing anything, so you need that voice to be your eyes into the story. This is a clip from one of the first episodes that we published. It's called The Stowaway. It tells the story of 2 friends, 2 Peruvian friends, who got into a boat, a big boat, a ship, that was going to travel from Peru to New York. That's the vehicle that they chose to migrate into the United States. And listen how the journalist, that will be Nancy Lopez, that's the first woman that talks in the clip, describes where they are, and also how Mayer, that is one of the friends, also described his experience inside that boat.
Al día siguiente, el barco emprendió su camino. Al día siguiente, el barco emprendió su camino. Llevaba toneladas de
That
carga de
pum 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 pum
fruta,
pum
de
pum,
verdura.
that's like
Llevaba
gold
200
for storytellers,
esquiladores
right?
de más de una
Like you're there
docena
with
de
him,
países.
he's recreating
Y dos
everything
jóvenes
just with his
cubanos.
voice. So you also want to get
Bien
that kind of
escondiditos
descriptive tape.
en la última
And
bodega.
finally,
Mayer
you
y
need
su amigo
interpretive
Mario,
tape. It's
cada
not
quien
enough
acostado,
to
agarrado de
the
una
character
tabla de
tell you
madera en
what's
la
happening,
oscuridad total.
how it's happening, but they also need to tell you what they think about it. You need them to reflect about their experience, right? So that allows you to pause the action for a little bit and to get inside their minds, inside their feelings. So you also need them to reflect. The clip that we're going to listen to, it's by Ana Mer from an episode called Temporary Permanence. She's a Venezuelan migrant. She's in Peru. She finally found a place where she thought that was going to settle down after leaving her country that is in chaos. And there were two things happening to her that she didn't feel that she could quite feel okay or definitely settled. First is that she was waiting every day to get a message from her family or from the news telling that Venezuela was okay again, that something was going to change. So she was always thinking, when is that message going to arrive? And the second thing is that xenophobia started growing in Peru and started affecting her directly. So those two things made her reflect about her experience as a migrant, and you will listen to her reflecting on that.
Esto de emigrar, además de que estás lejos de tu familia, es como que no te terminas de ir de Venezuela. Cada vez que pasa algo en Venezuela, te afecta directamente a ti. Nosotros ahorita estamos aquí, como nos podemos ir a otro país, como nos podemos ir a otro y a otro, porque simplemente nuestra vida cabe en una maleta. Nuestra vida es una maleta.
For those of you on the back, do you listen okay? Okay, perfect, thank you. Let's listen to the last example of interpretive tape. This is Carlos. He works as a coyote in this frontier, in this border. He smuggles people from Mexico to the U.S. And let's listen to what he has to say about his experience doing that.
Estamos aquí, como nos podemos ir a otro país, como nos podemos ir a otro y a otro, porque simplemente nuestra vida cabe en una maleta. Nuestra vida es una maleta, se convirtió en eso. Y siendo casi como nos vinimos, nos podemos ir y nos tenemos que ir.
Según las autoridades de nuestro país, somos unos delincuentes, todo el que es coyote. Muchas veces también ayudamos a muchos indocumentados. Después que terminas un trabajo, un viaje, te quedas con el sentimiento de que hiciste buenos amigos.
So you feel in his voice many things. He's not only reflecting, but you feel his confidence, you feel that there is a true emotion or connection with the people he's working with. A lot of things can be communicated in human voice, and when you're not having other medium, other formats like video, you focus on that. You focus on what a voice can bring, and you are transformed by it too. There are other elements that are important for an audio story, like the sound effects, like the using archive sound, many things. But if you don't have tape, if you don't have good tape, if you don't have those kind of characters, you better not start, because that's like the building block. The second thing that a good story needs is a story arc, that I don't know why it's in caps, but it's a story arc. You need it. This, like in Radio Ambulante, all of our stories has that. They have that, sorry. They set up an initial action or an initial situation. They present the character, then something happens to the character, and that triggers a conflict that he or she must solve. And the story ends when the character is transformed by all these series of events that the story describes. It sounds abstract, but it isn't. You're going to listen about Yaretsi, another Venezuelan migrant. When journalist Jenny Barchfield met her, Yaretsi had just left Venezuela, and she was living in a refugee camp, an improvised refugee camp, in a small town in Brazil called Pacaraima. So let's listen to Yaretsi and her story. It's very short.
Tengo 37 años, vengo del Tigre, estado en Suárez y soy profesora en educación integral.
Para ese entonces, Yaretsi llevaba 2 meses viviendo en el campamento con su familia.
Bueno, mi carpa es de 4 personas, dormimos 4, mis 2 hijas, mi esposo y yo.
Esa misma carpa la compraron en Venezuela para irse de vacaciones.
Era para ir a la playa como costumbre, como hacíamos buen venezolano para vacacionar, para una Semana Santa, Carnaval, pasar 2, 3 días en la playa. Pero en vista de la situación, más nunca.
So Yaretsi is in the midst of a transformation. She bought a tent to enjoy her free time with her family and ended up using it in a refugee camp at the other side of the border. It may seem extraordinary or something unusual, but it could happen to any of us. It could happen to anyone who has bought a tent, actually. Like, it's an universal conflict. And what we just heard is the beginning of the story arc. It's the beginning of a sequence of events that will start building on each other until they reach a climax. Something happens to Yaretsi that actually breaks her storyline in two, right? So that's just the beginning, but you want to know what will happen next. You want to know what will happen to Yaretsi. You want to know what happened to that tent. We don't mention it if it's not important. That tent has an importance in the story. And by making listeners ask themselves that question, what will happen next, you will keep them on the edge of the seat. You will keep the narrative tension high. And when you do that, you're having their full attention. And when you have full attention, that's the first condition for empathy to happen. When you're listening to a story, another person's story, with full attention, you're letting them inhabit you, you're letting them transform you, right? You're changing with themselves, you're changing with their story. So we need that. You need the attention. And to get the attention, you need what will happen next. That's what we do. All these technical devices, the characters, the different kind of tape, the story arc, are justified if at the end the story hits the target. And for us, the target is that the transformation of the character, the transformation of Yaretsi, the transformation of Carlos, the transformation of Majer, all those characters is your transformation, is listener's transformation. So that experience of these voices that we present will help others to understand from the inside of them, what it means to be Latin American. That's our mission, right? We want to bring greater understanding. So we do it by opening you to their experience. And we hope that at the end, that will help you understand what it is to be Latin American. What is this region? And just a quick parenthesis, when we talk about Latin America, we talk about the US too. Like, there are more than 50 million people here that speak Spanish, because they migrated, because they're sons of migrants. So the US, it's also Latin America for us. After describing these two narrative elements, voice and structure, I want to make a brief analogy between the stories and the physical borders. That is the theme of this keynote. So as we mentioned in the beginning, physical borders are stories, are fictions that manifest in the territory as real things, but they're fictions. It's important to understand their narrative features, because if we know how they work, if we know how they operate on the symbolical level, then we will have more power to go beyond them and encounter with each other. So let's talk about things that we've learned about that relationship. First is that the narrative conflict is itself a border. the main obstacle in the character's transformation, the conflict, and in the clips that we listen is like Yaretsi and Raikel is like, should we leave that Indian guy behind us? Should we leave him? It's like someone who needs help. Should we leave him? That's a big, big conflict. Should we save ourselves with this little kid, or should we help this guy? It's hard to decide. Or in the case of Carlos, the coyote, should he keep doing that? It's illegal. But he thinks that he's serving people. He thinks that he is giving like something that's necessary for them that will change their life. Or in the case of the woman from Venezuela, that I forgot her name, I'm sorry, it's like, should he take roots in a country that is rising xenophobia, that has rising xenophobia? In Radio Ambulante, we tell stories where each character finds a way to solve the conflict of crossing to the other side, right? And this is like the real life. We don't know how will they manage to do it. It's unpredictable. And we focus on that tension arising from how unpredictable it is to reach the other side. The harder the challenge the character faces, the more impactful and engaging a story will be, right? The second lesson, or the second thing we've learned, is that crossing the border is redefining your identity. When you cross a border, you change your identity. And this happens in the physical border, this happens in the symbolic border. A story finishes, a Radio Ambulante story finishes, it lands when the character solves the conflict and ends up in a different place from where he or she started. A place from which they can look back on what has been and ponder on their own change. You want a character always in a good story to have that movement, that they can at the end look back and say, wow, I was that was me. Does the same thing happen when you cross a border, a physical one? Maybe. For many people, crossing borders, physical borders, is like a rite of passage. It's just that. And Radio Ambulante's very first episode, called Mudanzas, or The Moves, we feature 5 stories about what you become when you migrate. It changes your identity completely. It puts you on the edge. It makes you discover things that were not in the center, that is what you think you were. The third thing that it's important is that in audio stories, in every stories actually, but in stories, that person who's listening to the story or watching the story, reading the story, also travels through the conflict, or also feels the conflict, and is affected by it. So the stories we tell in journalism, in our kind of journalism, those stories transcend like the news, that just informative level. News are important, like news inform, they're great, nice, but our stories, in addition to informing, operate changes in our listeners. As I mentioned you, when you listen to our stories, we don't want you to find out about what happened to them, what happened to other people. We want you to think or to feel, this happened to me, or this could happen to me, right? And that creates a different relationship with the information. This dramatic effect not only makes the story more memorable, you will not forget it because you feel that you lived it, but it also helps people to understand the experience from the context where it took place. Fourth, migration is much more than politics. It's a human affair. Although it's pressing to point how our governments or politicians try to turn migration into an electoral weapon, for example, at the expense of the dignity and safety of millions of people, we believe it's necessary to expand the narrative and showcase other dimensions of the migratory experience. Just like we report about the abuses of power against migrants, we also produce stories that highlight how communities are transformed in a positive way through migration. We did a story called, this story was called El Extranjero, the Foreigner, and told the story about a Haitian guy who moved to a very, very small town in Chile, a very white small town in Chile. And you would think this is gonna be tragic, and it's completely the opposite. They organized themselves to help him help his family to come to Chile, and it created like a kind of solidarity that this town was not used to. We also tell stories, humorous stories, about the misunderstanding when a migrant tries to learn a new language. That it's amazing story. It's called Escuchadme Terráqueos. If you Google it, it's great. We tell stories about civic resistance to prevent injustices toward those who have yet to legalize their migratory status. Last week, we published a story called A Human Chain, Una Cadena Humana, about the human chain that was created around an undocumented migrant in Nashville, Tennessee, that became viral like 3 months ago. And we tell the story of those who were there holding hands to protect that undocumented immigrant. A lot of these stories that show how migration is much more than just a politics issue. And expanding the narrative is the only way to reveal a diverse and somewhat representative mosaic of an experience that takes place on many levels. Borders sometimes regulate mobility between countries, sometimes, because they fail, right? But they always, borders always reveal the true character of those who encounter them. So we want to understand, who are you when you meet a border? And finally, is that another CAPS word that I don't know why it's there, but which voices are being left out? You have to ask yourself that. Which voices are being left out? Because one of our goals is to shed light on the nuances in the discussion about migration across the continent. And it's the simplistic narratives that create the illusion that language is not enough to understand and solve conflicts. And the resulting frustration of feeling that the language is not enough is channeled through violence. So at Radio Ambulante, we look at those arguments in greater depth and try to include as many voices as necessary to understand the phenomenon. The undocumented immigrant voice is there, the coyote voice is there, the judge is there, the border patrol agent is there. We want you to have, to feel how they understand this experience. And when you do that, you will, as an individual, you will also grow your perspective on the issue. Finally, before we wrap up, I want to point out a few features that allow podcasts, the medium we chose to tell stories, to become increasingly popular today and more appealing to storytellers the world over. These are just 4 points. The first one is that your ears understand the digital world better than any other sense. This was said by Marshall McLuhan 50 years ago. The internet, or the electronic technology, is a technology that it's closer to the ear, or that favors more the ear than the eye. The fragmentation, the division that we see in the actual world, the maps, the borders, are a result of another technology to distribute the information that was the printing press. The printing press creates you the illusion that you have your own point of view, that you can see the world from here. This is you, this is the world, the page, what is there. Instead, internet creates networks, right? The electronic technology to distribute information creates horizontal networks. And those networks surround you all the time. You cannot avoid them. You're surrounded by them, as you cannot close your ears, right? It's something that it's always happening, that you're always feeling. So it's very, very important that as storytellers, you understand how technology is changing the way of people consume stories, interact with information, and organize themselves around that technology. We cannot tell stories the same way we were telling them 30 years ago. We just can't if we really want to have an impact. So podcasts, a medium that is only voice, that privileged orality, has that kind of impact, has a strong impact, because it creates a different relationship between the storyteller and those who are listening. It's not the same relationship that we had with radio, in which I was producing radio to target masses. I'm not targeting masses when I'm doing a podcast. I'm targeting you and you and you, like individuals. And we will create this niche network of shared interest, and I will talk to you as I talk to my friends. I will talk to you as I talk in the living room of my house. And that creates a different kind of trust that you don't see in the former media. right? You don't see that in the mass media. So you need to understand that your ears understand the world. Second, and it's very important too, is that podcasts welcome silence and attention, something that it's like we're lacking a lot of attention right now, right? Like, not right now, thank you, but in our world, we're all the time like attacked, or we're under a stream of information that never ends. And when you listen to a podcast, you need to quiet down, you need to suspend your judgment for a little bit and listen to the story and focus on the story. It's very uncomfortable to listen to a podcast, play, go back, play, go. If that's happening, it's because you're not there. Better not to listen in that moment. But when you're actually listening to a podcast, you are inside the story. They favor attention. You have to be quiet for a while. And that creates like that. I think that gives a lot of agency to that person that's listening, and it's also a very spiritual activity or exercise. Third, they feel personal. The main difference between radio and podcast, that's something that we're asked a lot about, is that, as I told you, podcasts are made just for you. They're personal. You follow a podcast because you feel that they're your friends. Radio Ambulante is your friend, or This American Life, they are your friends. Ira Glass, my best friend, I don't have his number, but my best friend, right? You feel them close. And four, they're a conversation. Podcasts trigger conversations and encourage reciprocity. As I told you, they create a network. It's horizontal, and you need to understand that you're not like you don't have the monopoly of information or of knowledge of that network. If it's really a network, the knowledge is all around. So you need to listen to those who are listening to you too, and to have conversations with them, conversations that will shape also the way you do your journalism. And that's what we do at Radio Ambulante. And to finish, two current challenges that we're tackling and that I'm very excited about and we're very excited about. First is that there is a barrier or a border that we don't talk about that much, or maybe we do, and it's the digital border. Like we sometimes, I don't know you, but sometimes I feel locked in screens. I feel that my life is happening in front of a screen. And that may be nice because I meet people from all over and I can like work with a remote team, but sometimes I need to just like talk to you, see you, how do you react, tell me what you feel, right? To get this body language. So how do we make use of the trust that we built in the Radio Ambulante community so people can get out of the screens, listen to the podcast together, and have civic conversations around our journalism? It was very ambitious, but we were like, let's try it. Let's invite people to meet and listen to a podcast together, make it a collective experience. And we created the listening clubs. Listening clubs were presented earlier this year in February, and we were so excited when people were like, yeah, I want to do that too. I want to meet with strangers in my city who listen to Radio Ambulante and talk to them about the podcast. And we were like, really? And they were like, yeah. And there are 75 listening clubs all over the world happening every week, every 2 weeks, every month, of people meeting with strangers, listening to a podcast together, and then having a conversation about how that episode that may not be about their community, it's very probable that it will not be about their community, but how that episode resonates with them. How does it light or shine a light on their needs, on what they want, on how they want to imagine their community? So we created this. It's amazing. It's an open source project, so if you want to create a listening club, you can do it. It doesn't have to be about Radio Ambulante. You can just use that logo. We did a toolkit with all the steps to do it in a very efficient way. I can send that to you, or you can, I can send it to, I will post it in the platform. That's what the platform is for, right? I will do that, and you will be able to download all the materials and use them for your favorite podcast. And the second challenge that we have right now is the language barrier. We do an amazing journalism. We're very proud of it, but we are aware that many people don't listen Spanish, don't understand Spanish. So That's a problem because this is a very fascinating region. Like all Latin America is a fascinating continent with universal conflicts, and we're telling stories that can relate to anyone in the world. But if they don't know Spanish, they will miss it. How do we do that? So we created an app. We created an app that helps you to learn Spanish with Radio Ambulante, with our podcast. And it's a very cool app. It's called Lupa. So Lupa, you'll be listening to Radio Ambulante, and you will be able to highlight the words that you don't know. You will be able to slow down the speed. You will be able to do many things that will help you to get to a fluent level of Spanish while you're listening to a great podcast. We partner with former Google developers who were like the ones who developed Lupa, and check this video that it's very short about how it works. You can display the words if you want. Then if you don't understand a word, you can pause.
Vamos a ir entonces a contarnos. Entonces le preguntó al suizo, me acuerdo muy bien que empezó a hablar el suizo.
You can slow down.
No, yo me acuerdo una vez que llegué.
That's just one feature. There are many features. So if you want to learn Spanish because you're in Tijuana, you want to understand the world around you, just go to lupa.app and you will be able to learn. This is Radio Ambulante. Thanks very much for your attention. I will be happy to answer questions. Hola. Okay. Yeah, you can ask questions.
Perhaps I will be talking about history of a generation. I remember it was wonderful. I like very much your presentation and brought me back to many years to the famous Radio Sutatensa in Colombia, and how the effort changed totally when the transistors appear, and therefore they didn't have the opportunity to get together just to be attentive to the 7 o'clock or whatever when there was going to be the transmission by radio, and the whole community were together and they have the possibility to discuss, reflect, and all that. But I can see on a perspective of time that you are taking fascinating all these elements that are there. And really, and I like very much how you connect. There is, from what I was listening to the stories, so much metaphors, so many symbols, so much food for reflection, nutrition, and all these kind of things. Thank you so much. Huh? It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Janet Nguyen. I'm actually working on a project to capture Vietnamese refugee stories, and so I'm curious to know, like, how long does each of your episodes take, and like, how did, like, from starting it up, like, how many people did you guys start with?
The episodes last between 20 minutes, 40 minutes. There are some of them that are 50 minutes. Beyond 50 minutes, we cut them in two different parts. But yeah, 20, 25, 30 minutes is like the sweet spot, I think. Radio Ambulante started with 4 people, like 4 founders and many producers, external producers. But if you want to do like this kind of podcast, narrative podcast, there are like a few essential positions that you need. One is producer, someone who will go interview, get the tape that we mentioned, descriptive, narrative, interpretive. You need an editor, someone who is not that close to the story that will help you structure it and get that narrative arc. And you will need a sound engineer, someone who will be able to organize that in the software, maybe do a little bit of sound effects and music if it's possible. There are many like free libraries up there that you can use. If you have those 3 positions, you will be good to start something decent.
And like, sorry, how long does like, how long did production take for your first ones?
That takes a lot. It can take 6 months for an episode. to be done.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I work on migration and sustainable development in the Middle East, and this means so much to me. And it's a very different context where I work, and I was wondering, what do you do to maybe protect the identity of some of the storytellers? How does it go? Is there a certain agreement that you make with them, or are they usually okay with discussing who they are and where they are? Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Yeah, it depends on how sensitive the story is. Some characters, they decide not to share the stories with their real names. So we just published a story about this shaman in Colombia who was actually like a sexual abuser who was assaulting women for years, and many of his victims stood up and denounced him and told us their stories, but they didn't want to be exposed with their real names, so we just changed the names. But many people, they don't have a problem because this is audio, and it's very, like, the risk is not the same as in TV, that your face is there, your full identity is there. So many people accept to share their stories openly. But it depends on the case, and you have to be very aware of it. You're welcome.
Thank you very much for showing us your work. And I was very much impressed with the component of the listening parties. And I wonder if this might be an opening for potential political responsiveness. I know that when we hear a story, yes, we empathize, we're emotionally impacted, but I wonder if you and your team have considered also incorporating tools that individuals can use to penetrate the legal system and become politically active in that moment, in that gathering.
Mm-hmm. Well, personally, I'm not talking as Radio Ambulante here, but personally, that's my dream. I would love listening clubs to trigger that kind of civic action, right? Because we're doing journalism. As journalists, what our role is just to inform. We want that. We want to inform communities about what's important to them so they can take action. But the way the news are structured today, they don't foster that much. A lot of times, journalism, because of the way we're using technology and many different things, is disempowering people sometimes, or it just creates cynicism. So how do we make our journalism impactful? How do we make journalism the beginning of that action that you're mentioning? So getting people together with strangers and looking eye to eye, sharing differences, I think it's the beginning. It's hard, it's uncomfortable, but it's necessary. And as journalists, we cannot do anything to push them to action, right? More than informing them. But maybe if these clubs, I don't know, partner with local activists or I don't know who, that can lead to something else. But it depends on the clubs, on how can they transform that conversation.
Hi, Caroline Bailey. I was just wondering, as a follow-up to that, about forum theatre, theatre of the oppressed, where the audience become the spectators and can go on stage and say, no, it's not like that, it's like this. And it becomes very participatory. And I wonder about a spectator version of the radio, and that listeners can then respond, and it broadens the conversation.
I love that. Thank you. Yeah, it's very dramatic, actually. It has a... Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about, I think about podcasts kind of enforcing this trend that we have where our news becomes even more siloed. So very different from the radio in the past. You would turn it on as you're driving in the car and you would listen to kind of whatever happened to be playing, right? I mean, more or less you can change the channel, but now I think I want to listen to something about well-being, and then you choose exactly what you want to listen at that time, and how that can be limiting in terms of what you're exposed to. So I wanted to ask if Radio Ambulante has planned, first, how Radio Ambulante promotes themselves. How you guys promote yourselves, and if that's something you think about, like trying to enter into certain spaces where maybe this type of news or information is not normally being accessed.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the answer starts with our stories being mainly entertaining. Like even if we're covering like the family separations in the US, the story has to be good. The story has to keep you there on the edge of your seat. So the promise is that if you listen to any Radio Ambulante story, no matter what the news is or the information, the content is, you will be entertained in a way. I'm not saying that it's like a superficial thing. It's just that you will feel that something is happening and you will be there. But it also, like, we are limited by a number of episodes per year. We only publish 24 episodes per season, and there are many things happening. Right now in Latin America, I don't know if you are following the news, but there are protests in Panama, there are protests in Bolivia, in Chile, there was recent protests in Ecuador, in Colombia, and we cannot cover that at the pace that like we would like to. So yeah, we would like to explore a different kind of show maybe, where we can follow that, but at the core of any show that we will create will be that storytelling thing, storytelling focus. So we promote ourselves as that. You will inform yourself, but you will also have a good time listening to it. And I think that that's the characteristic of shows that we like a lot, like The Daily, for example, of the New York Times, is that you get the news, but you also, yeah.
Hi, that's a good segue into the question I actually had for you as well. I was wondering how you choose what issues or what aspects of Latin American identity to prioritize as you're going about kind of sourcing these stories and also sourcing the storytellers, and how you're able to build trust with those individuals to get them to kind of talk about some deeply personal, potentially traumatic experiences in their past.
Thank you. Yeah, the Latin American experience is like the human experience, right? There are things that are own of Latin America. We speak a language that is new to that territory. We're intentional. We have like this heritage, like indigenous, that like creates tension with that language that we're using. It's a very fascinating region, but it's a human experience. So we can cover many different things. We cover migration, is a big one because it defines our identity, but we also cover mental health. We cover women issues, well, like women rights. We cover corruption. We cover a lot of things. And we only have 24 episodes, so we try that the season like has a lot of different colors and different subjects, different themes. That's the main like logic behind how we choose the episodes, that at the end of the season, you will have a broad picture of what's happening in the region. And something interesting about our structure is that we're big now. We're 20 people, 19 people full-time. 2 years ago when I started, it was only 7 people. So we're growing fast. But many of our producers are over the region and are not part of Radio Ambulante. We just hire them to tell that story. And we've like built a name on the region, on the journalism field, so they trust that if you're going to tell a story in Radio Ambulante, it will have a lot of impact. It will be listened by many people, but it has to be very, very like well done. So we're very rigorous. We have fact-checking. We have a lot of things that guarantee that at the end, your story will be the best story possible. So journalists all over the region want to work with us, and they're willing to work with us because we're consistent with that quality.
Hi.
Hello.
My question is also about getting out of the silos, getting out of the niche networks. I can think of many people I know who I would like to develop this empathy with these stories, but these are not people who are Spanish speaking and would not take the time to learn Spanish. So, are you thinking of translating some of these and making them available in English in order to reach out to people and have people who wouldn't help people see the human side of this?
Yeah, so for every episode that we've done, you can have the English translation for free, but written. So you go to our website, radioambulante.org, and all the episodes have a translation, all of them. So you are able to read the episode, which is not the best thing, but it's okay. Like, you can still enjoy it. You're missing a lot, but you're enjoying it. So that's one thing. And for some episodes, we partner with podcasts here in the US, like This American Life or Radio Lab, 99% Invisible, who have reproduced our episodes in English, right? They adapt them, code switch from NPR. So some of our episodes have their own version in English, in audio, in partnership with others. And we do that often. No, but I will. That's a great thing to do. Thank you. Thank you. No, that's great. Great idea. I will do a list with all the English version of Radio Ambulante's episodes available. And yeah, I don't know why we hadn't thought about it. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
I don't have to. I appreciate the invitation to be the last question. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
I'm coming from grad school with limited and varied experience, so I can be very naive and idealistic. I'm wondering about, firstly, like commending the figures of your growth in viewership from 7,000 to 7 million regular listeners in 6 or 7 years. That's amazing. Clearly, you're an educational organization, intentionally and unintentionally, and I wonder how you do currently, or how you would be currently thinking about, or if you just wouldn't do monitoring and evaluation around learning objectives in your audience.
Thank you. That's amazing. That's very ambitious for us because we're mainly journalism, but we have that dimension of educating. We have a group in Facebook that it's called Teaching with Radio Ambulante. So many professors and teachers in the US who use Radio Ambulante to teach Spanish. They're connected. We have like 2,000 people in the mailing list and 1,000 people in Facebook. And they do that. They share how are they using this podcast to teach different things, not only Spanish, to teach economics, to teach Latin American history. I think that for now, it's up to them how they evaluate how Radio Ambulante's impact is in an education environment. But maybe later, who knows? We will be also working on that thing. But for now, we're just facilitating them to have a great experience using the podcast and measuring how it's useful or not to learn in general. Thank you. Yeah, sure.
Thank you for your work. I think your podcasts and others are a very engaging format. I can personally speak because I've stopped hearing podcasts in my car because I crashed and totaled it. But my question here is to talk about when you said that it takes about 6 months to produce the episodes and that you mostly consider yourself as a journalistic organization. I would love to hear a little bit about the recency of the content, right? I mean, you're building an episode on something that happened 3 months ago and what that impact is in the process of educating listeners.
So let me rephrase, so if I understood, why it takes so long?
No, it's more so about the fact that the story might be about something that's maybe 6 months ago, and what that impact might be.
I think that the criteria there is that, like, the kind of events that we cover, or the kind of conflicts that we cover, are conflicts that are permanent, or at least that are alive whenever we publish them. We're not covering emergencies, we're not covering crises, we're covering like the deep trends of the region. So when we tell the story of Joandra and Raikel, who are migrating, who are Cubans, maybe when we publish the story, I think when we published that story, the wet feed, dry feed policy had already ended. So for other outlets, other media outlets, it would have been like irrelevant to have published that story because the news interest or the audience interest had already been washed away. Because, yeah, why? The policy already ended. But when you listen to the story, you understand the sense of urgency of migrants, in this case Cubans, migrants, but migrants in general. So I think that we work at a different rhythm, a different pace, because the things that we cover are things that are still important and are very, very important in the region. And by covering them slowly, by taking the time to understand the perspective, to see how the thing evolved on time, it doesn't matter if the newsy interest is not there in the other media, because at the end, we craft a very, very well told story that will have an impact and will increase your understanding of the theme. So we are not worried about that much. Of course, there are things that you have to tell right now. For example, when Mexico was affected by the earthquake in 2017, we published a story 1 week after, right? When the families were being separated in the border here in the US, we published an episode 2 weeks after that started to happening. We can react quickly, but we prefer to take our time to understand how things are moving and are evolving, and tell a good story that will make you never forget about that. Not just the facts, but the experience. I have stickers, a lot of stickers of Radio Ambulante. So anytime when you see me, and I will give you a sticker.